In 465 BCE, a woman was dragged into the courtyard of the most magnificent palace on earth, not escorted, not summoned with ceremony. Dragged. Across stone polished by generations of power, beneath columns designed to overwhelm the senses and remind all who entered that they stood inside the center of the world. What followed was so brutal that even the soldiers charged with enforcing the king's will could not later speak of it without their voices shaking. These were men hardened by war, by executions, by conquest. Yet this moment marked them, because the violence they witnessed was not the chaos of battle. It was deliberate, intimate, controlled. Her crime was not treason. She had not plotted rebellion or raised a hand against the throne. She had done something far more dangerous in a system built on absolute obedience. She had said no to the wrong man. And it is here that the story turns from horror into something deeper and more unsettling. Because this was not an exception. This was not a lapse in an otherwise orderly reign. This was one day in the Persian royal court, one act in a pattern that stretched across decades, a pattern that transformed the world's most beautiful palace into a chamber of psychological torture, where power did not merely rule bodies, but invaded minds, reshaped identities, and punished resistance at its root. The man responsible is not a mystery. You know his name. You have seen his armies march across cinema screens. You have watched him portrayed as a towering figure of antiquity, a warrior king who hurled millions against Greece, a ruler whose ambition carved monuments from stone and left ruins that still astonish the modern world. History wants you to remember King Xerxes I of Persia this way: heroic, distant, monumental. That is the version that survives most easily. It fits neatly into timelines and textbooks. It is easier to digest. But behind those golden walls, another war was being fought. A war without swords or shields. A war where there were no battle lines to cross and no enemy banners to rally against. The victims of this war could not flee. They could not fight back. They could not even speak their truth without risking everything they loved, their families, their bodies, their very existence. This was a war waged in silence, enforced by ritual, and sustained by the belief that power itself was sacred. And it is here, in this hidden conflict, that the true cost of absolute power begins to reveal itself. If the violence of that courtyard feels distant, it is only because history has trained us to look in the wrong direction. We are taught to measure atrocity by the scale of battlefields, by the number of soldiers who fall, by cities burned and borders redrawn. But what if the greatest crime of Xerxes' reign had nothing to do with Greece at all? What if it unfolded not across seas and mountain passes, but behind locked doors, beneath gilded ceilings, in the very place meant to embody order and protection? What if it was happening every single day to the people who should have been safest in his presence? This is where the story demands that you stay with it. Because what follows does not simply revise a chapter of ancient history. It dismantles the lens through which that history has been viewed for centuries. The version of Persia most of us inherit is one of grand armies and imperial ambition, of spectacle and scale. This other version, the one buried beneath 2,000 years of silence, is harder to confront. It implicates systems rather than enemies, rituals rather than moments of rage. And it forces us to reckon with a form of violence that leaves no ruins dramatic enough to demand remembrance. So let us begin where historians rarely do, not with conquest, but with consequence. What does it do to a human being when everyone around them insists they are not human at all? When the world they inhabit refuses to acknowledge their agency, their voice, their interior life. When obedience is mistaken for virtue and silence is mistaken for harmony. Over time, this kind of denial does more than punish individuals. It reshapes reality itself. It teaches people to see themselves as instruments rather than beings, as extensions of another's will rather than owners of their own lives. This is why the story remained buried. It does not fit neatly into the familiar categories of heroism and defeat. It cannot be reduced to a single villain or a single moment. Instead, it exposes how absolute power operates in private, how it corrodes empathy and turns proximity into danger. By the end of this journey, the image of Xerxes as a distant warrior king will feel insufficient, even evasive. What will stand in its place is something far more unsettling, a portrait of power that did not need to conquer foreign lands in order to destroy lives. It only needed silence, ritual, and time. To understand how such a hidden war could exist at all, we have to step backward, to the moment when the man at its center ceased to be treated as human himself. October 486 BCE. In the throne room of Persepolis, a 36-year-old man named Xerxes receives the crown of the largest empire the world has ever known. His father, Darius the Great, is dead. The empire stretches across continents, bound together by fear, tribute, and ritual. And from this moment forward, something essential is taken from Xerxes as well: the possibility of a single, genuine human interaction. Think about what that means. From the instant the crown touches his head, every relationship in his life is transformed into performance. Anyone who approaches him must submit to an elaborate ritual known as proskynesis. They do not bow. They do not kneel. They fall face down on the ground, pressing their lips to the earth before him, their bodies flattened in complete submission, as if standing in the presence of a god rather than a man. Conversation ceases to be exchange. It becomes ceremony. There are rules, and they are absolute. No one may ever turn their back on him. To do so is death. No one may look directly into his eyes without explicit permission. No one may speak unless spoken to first. Even silence is regulated. Even posture is policed. Every gesture reinforces the same message, repeated thousands of times a day. You are divine, and everyone else is less than human. The Greek historian Herodotus recorded details of Persian court protocol that make the psychological cost of this system impossible to ignore. If someone carried urgent news, cities falling, revolts igniting, borders collapsing, they could not simply enter the throne room. They waited outside for days, sometimes weeks, hoping for permission. Even if the empire was burning, you waited, because interrupting the god king at the wrong moment could cost you your head. The ritual mattered more than reality. And this is where the story becomes truly dangerous. Xerxes was not born believing he was divine. He was trained into it. Day after day, year after year, the court taught him that vulnerability was fatal, that equality did not exist, and that empathy was weakness. When no one is allowed to speak honestly to you, when every face is pressed into the dirt, humanity itself begins to feel like an illusion. In such an environment, power does not merely isolate, it reshapes the mind. And once a man is taught that he stands above humanity, the humanity of others becomes disturbingly easy to erase. This machinery of ritual did not arise by accident, nor did it sustain itself without guidance. Herodotus's account of Persian court protocol reveals more than excessive ceremony. It exposes a system designed to sever the ruler from reality itself. If you carried urgent news, cities collapsing, rebellions igniting, borders failing, you did not rush into the throne room. You waited. Days, sometimes weeks. Even as the empire burned, you stood outside in silence, hoping to be summoned. Because in this world, the stability of ritual mattered more than the truth it concealed. To interrupt the god king at the wrong moment was not merely rude, it was fatal. But the most insidious element of this system is not the fear it imposed on others. It is what it did to Xerxes himself. He was not born believing he was divine. He was made that way, slowly, deliberately, relentlessly. At the center of that transformation stood his mother, Atossa, a woman who understood power more intimately than almost anyone in the ancient world. She was the daughter of Cyrus the Great, founder of the empire, and she had watched firsthand how dynasties devoured themselves. Brothers poisoned brothers, sons murdered fathers, entire bloodlines vanished overnight. From those lessons, Atossa learned a brutal truth. In the Persian court, family was not safety. It was the most dangerous threat of all. So she taught her son how to survive. Trust nothing. Control everything. Show no weakness. Because the moment you are seen as human, the moment you appear vulnerable, you are already dead. These were not abstract principles. They were survival tactics passed down through bloodshed. And under Atossa's influence, Xerxes absorbed them completely. Greek sources suggest she wielded more power over him than any advisor or general, shaping not only his politics, but his inner world. What she created was not merely a king. She created something far more dangerous, a man who genuinely believed that other human beings existed only as extensions of his will. In such a worldview, resistance is not disagreement. It is disorder. Refusal is not personal choice. It is an attack on the structure of reality itself. When power is framed as sacred, opposition becomes blasphemy. This is the psychological foundation upon which everything that follows rests. A ruler raised to see empathy as weakness, isolation as necessity, and obedience as proof of cosmic order will not experience cruelty as cruelty. He will experience it as correction. And once that line is crossed, violence no longer feels like excess. It feels like duty. With that psychological foundation in place, the setting of what followed comes sharply into focus. We need to talk about the place where this system expressed itself most fully, not on battlefields or in throne rooms, but inside the royal household itself. This is where popular imagination fails completely. Hollywood has trained us to picture the Persian court as an endless spectacle of indulgence, an eternal bachelor party of excess, pleasure, and whim, where women existed as interchangeable ornaments in a ruler's private fantasy. That image is not just inaccurate, it obscures something far more calculated and far more disturbing. The Persian royal household, known as the Andaron, was not a space of chaos or indulgence. It was a carefully engineered political institution, as structured and deliberate as any bureaucracy of state. Far from being incidental to power, it was one of its primary instruments. And contrary to popular myth, Xerxes appears to have been married to only one woman throughout his adult life, Queen Amestris. This alone should force a reconsideration of the caricature. Amestris was not a passive figure. She controlled vast estates, commanded her own troops, oversaw major construction projects, and held audiences with foreign dignitaries. She was, in every meaningful sense, one of the most powerful individuals in the empire. The Andaron was home to women of extraordinary status, the king's mother, his wife, his sisters, his daughters, and the wives and daughters of his closest relatives. They lived surrounded by wealth that defies modern comparison. Their robes were worth more than entire cities. Their tables were supplied with delicacies transported across continents. Hundreds of servants existed solely to anticipate and fulfill their needs. From the outside, it looked like absolute privilege, but this luxury concealed absolute confinement. Greek physician Ctesias, who served at the Persian court decades after Xerxes' death, described quarters sealed behind massive walls and locked gates. No male visitors were permitted, except the king himself and a limited number of eunuchs, men who had been physically altered to ensure obedience and eliminate threat. The women could look out from high windows at the city below, hear the sounds of life continuing beyond the walls, yet they could not participate in it. They could not leave. They had everything except the one thing that defines freedom, agency over their own existence. Most chilling of all, this was not understood as oppression. It was framed as honor, as protection, as the highest privilege a woman could achieve. From birth, these women were taught to see the cage as a palace, their isolation as intimacy with power, their powerlessness as proof of importance. This is what makes the system so effective and so cruel. When control is dressed as care, when confinement is mistaken for reverence, the victims begin to defend the very structure that erases them. With the machinery of power and confinement fully in view, the narrative turns from structure to rupture. This is where Herodotus enters the story, not as a neutral chronicler, but as an uneasy witness to something that even ancient historians struggled to absorb. Writing roughly 30 years after Xerxes' death, Herodotus records an episode so disturbing that scholars have argued over it for more than 2 millennia. Some dismiss it as Greek propaganda. Others call it exaggeration. A few suggest it may be fiction. And yet, the details he provides are so precise, so psychologically coherent, that they refuse to be ignored. According to Herodotus, sometime after the disastrous Greek campaign, after Xerxes returned home humiliated, his authority shaken, and his paranoia sharpened, the king developed an obsession with the wife of his own brother, Macestes. Her name is not preserved. History did not consider it worth recording. That absence alone is telling. She enters the record not as a person, but as an event, as a problem, as a disruption. So let us call her what she was, a victim. She was married to one of the most powerful men in the empire, a military commander who governed provinces and commanded armies. She was a mother. She lived, by all accounts, a relatively ordinary life within the rigid constraints of royal culture. She did not seek power. She did not provoke scandal. And yet, Xerxes wanted her. This is where the story becomes psychologically revealing, because the king did not simply take what he desired. Despite a lifetime of conditioning that taught him his will was law, some part of Xerxes still sought consent, still wanted to be chosen, not merely obeyed. He approached her. He made advances. He made promises. And she refused. Consider what that meant. This was the most powerful man on earth, a ruler with absolute legal authority over life and death, a king who had ordered executions for far less than refusal. And she said no, not publicly, not defiantly, simply no. For most rulers, even tyrants, that would have ended the matter, perhaps with punishment, perhaps with consequences, but with closure. But Xerxes was not most rulers. His entire world had taught him that resistance to his desire was not personal choice, but cosmic disorder, a flaw in the structure of reality itself, something that needed to be corrected. And so he did not abandon the pursuit. He redirected it. He shifted his focus to her daughter, his own niece, a younger woman, likely in her late teens or early 20s, without her mother's protection or authority. Where the mother had the strength to refuse, the daughter did not. And in that shift, from refusal to vulnerability, the true nature of the system revealed itself. This was not about desire alone. It was about punishment, about demonstrating that saying no was not merely unacceptable, but unthinkable. What followed exposed the final, most brutal logic of absolute power. According to Herodotus, Xerxes promised the young woman, Artaiant, that she could ask for anything she desired. Anything in the empire, and it would be hers. This was not generosity. It was theater. A demonstration meant to prove that his reach had no limits. Whether she was manipulated into the request or made it of her own accord hardly matters, because the object she named was devastatingly precise. A single, irreplaceable robe woven by Queen Amestris herself, threaded with gold and royal purple, a symbol of her status and authority. Xerxes gave it to her without hesitation. He knew exactly what he was doing. He understood that gifting his mistress his wife's most personal emblem was a calculated insult, a spark thrown deliberately into a chamber filled with dry tinder. And this is where absolute power reveals one of its most perverse effects. Empathy does not merely erode, it inverts. The suffering of others becomes proof of dominance. Conflict becomes spectacle. Pain becomes currency. When Queen Amestris saw the robe on Artint, she understood immediately what it meant, and she did not respond with chaos or jealousy. She responded with precision. Amestris did not strike at the daughter. She targeted the mother, the woman who had dared to refuse the king in the first place, the one person in this story who had acted with restraint, dignity, and loyalty. Amestris waited for the perfect moment, the king's birthday feast, a public celebration governed by sacred custom. On that day, Persian law required the king to grant any request made before the assembled nobility. In front of the most powerful men in the empire, Amestris made her demand. She asked that the wife of Macestes be delivered to her as a gift. Xerxes understood immediately what this meant. He begged her to choose something else. He offered wealth, cities, armies. But the same rules that made him absolute now bound him completely. The request had been made publicly. It could not be refused. The woman was delivered into Amestris's custody. What happened next is among the most horrifying acts recorded in the ancient world. Herodotus describes a punishment designed not merely to kill, but to annihilate identity itself, to strip away every marker of personhood and return the body as a warning. The mutilation was deliberate, symbolic, and total. And when it was done, she was sent back to her husband alive, bearing the message carved into her flesh. This was not vengeance born of passion. It was policy. It declared that refusal itself was a crime worthy of erasure. That virtue offered no protection. That proximity to power was not safety, but danger. In this system, innocence was irrelevant. The only unforgivable act was saying no. If you found this story thought-provoking, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. History is not only about what happened, but why it mattered. Follow for more stories that explore power, fear, and the human mind.